ga niet zitten. Twee stoelen. Gentlemen, this was Arnoud Rosdorff. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. My name is Anne Wertheim. I'm the director of the John Adams Institute, which is the organizer behind the lecture series American Literature Today and American Focus. The John Adams Institute lecture series bring major figures, mostly Americans, of the arts, letters, and science and literature to Amsterdam, with an average of about 10 events per year. However, tonight is not dedicated to American literature, but to Canadian literature and the literary tradition in Canada. One of its most celebrated authors accepted our invitation to be with us tonight. We are greatly pleased to welcome you, Ms. Urquhart, and your daughter, Emily, to Amsterdam on this, for you, first visit. As you are well aware, other Canadian authors who have featured in our program in the past are Margaret Atwood, Carol Shields, Douglas Copeland, and Mordecai Richler. We're happy and proud to add you to this distinguished list. I would like to extend a special welcome to the Canadian Cultural Attaché, Marcel Lauman, and to other honored guests of the Canadian Embassy. I would also like to thank the Canadian Embassy for their participation in making this program possible. Tonight's lecture forms part of the celebrations around the 55th anniversary of the liberation of the Netherlands by the Canadians. The evening will start with an introductory talk by Wil Verhoeven, who teaches American and Canadian literature at Groningen University. Mr. Verhoeven has published several essays on Canadian writers. At 9 o'clock, there will be a short intermission, after which there will be a discussion between Ms. Urquhart and Mr. Verhoeven. Ms. Urquhart will also take questions from the audience, and if you prefer, you can hand in written questions during intermission at the book desk. There is no smoking in this room. It's very warm though, so you'll probably smoke away. And smokers are kindly requested to go outside or upstairs during intermission, of course. I will now give the floor to Wil Verhoeven, and I hope you enjoy your evening. Thank you. Wil?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much, Anne, for the invitation. I'm going to be very brief because I'm playing second fiddle here tonight to Jane Urquhart, of course. I've been given, the latest estimate was about 5 minutes to introduce Canadian. Can everybody hear me? I've been given 5 minutes to introduce Canadian literature from the beginning to the present day, and to introduce Jane Urquhart's work as well. So in 2.5 minutes then. It's not possible, but until recently there were many people that would have thought that 2.5 minutes to introduce Canadian literature was ample time. Until the Second World War, especially many Americans, and I know the last thing you should do in the world is confuse Americans and Canadians, but you know, they're so prolific in the world, Americans, that one might as well turn to them and ask them what they felt about Canadians. Until the World War II, Americans didn't even know that Canadians had literature. When I tell US colleagues that I teach, apart from American literature, English Canadian literature, they usually look at me and say, why? It's actually true. Edmund Wilson, who is a critic who worked and wrote at the beginning of this century in America, admitted at one point that, as far as he was concerned, and his whole generation, Canada was, for them, basically a game reserve where Americans went to hunt, but that's the only purpose for its existence. And if you were to say to him, what about Canadian literature, he would have laughed probably and said something like, is there any? It has to be admitted, though, that, and I'll be coming to the last 30 years in the last minute of my introduction, but it has to be admitted that until World War II, I hope you don't mind, Jane, Canadian literature couldn't be qualified as aesthetically innovative, intellectually challenging, or commercially very interesting. I'm going to summarize the first 3 centuries now by saying that the adverse conditions of Canada were not very conducive to writing creative work. It was sparsely populated. It was difficult to set up a commercial system of publications. There were very few libraries, etc., etc. But I think, and this is something that I think the audience should consider tonight, what basically distinguished Canadian from American literature is the fact that the histories are so completely different. America, we all know, is the country that rebelled against its parent country and developed a sense of a distinct national identity from 1776 onwards, which was very much and actively created through its writing. Now, Canada, of course, being a dominion, first a colony, then a dominion, part of the British Empire, which was also populated to a large extent by loyalists that fled from the South, from the US into Canada, had a completely different notion of its own identity. It wasn't independent. It never went through a sort of national adolescence, if you like the United States did. And therefore, it never developed that, what psychiatrists tell us is so essential, that sense of self through the fight against the parent. And I think that is, historically speaking, the most important reason why Canadian literature has been disparaged as much as I've just indicated until the late, I would say, the 1960s. I see people already wanting to jump at my throat and disagree with me, which is good for the discussion later on. Time's ticking on. The 1960s then, a clear break. I think that when we now talk about Canadian literature from a world perspective, from a European perspective, what we talk about is the writers that came up in the 1960s. When the Canadian society as a whole became much more self-conscious through the emancipation movements, the social-political movements that there were, of course, which triggered a sense of, hey, this is not us, this sort of watered-down version of merry old Britain, that's not us. There are here people that would not be associated with that British tradition. There's all kinds of minorities, there's all kinds of cultural traditions here that are not reflected by the British mainstream literature. And especially women, I think, began to profit from this quite a lot. The names that we would associate with that period might be Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood, especially Alice Munro, Mavis Gallant. Yet, what is Canadian about that literature? That is still a question that I would like to also pursue later on with Jane, because it's very hard to say what was Canadian about, even 1960s literature. Margaret Atwood was perhaps the first one, or one of the first anyway, who seriously tried to answer that question. And she came up with a label for what was distinctly Canadian about the literature, which has also become a kind of a stigma in a sense, but anyway, for a time it was a label, and that is the famous label of survival. Her theory was that the Brits were a culture of an island mentality. They were insular. That defined the soul of their being. The Americans had the symbol of the frontier. That defined, the going west type of mythology. And for Canada, it was survival. The weather, the conditions were so adverse that basically what Canadians were doing all the time was surviving. And that was reflected in their literature. This triggered a response because, of course, Atwood, being from Ontario, was not a real Canadian according to many other Canadians. She was sort of a watered-down version of the US or something like that. But anyway, not the real Canadian. The real Canadian was then defined as a Westerner, and Margaret Atwood's definition of survival as the key to Canadian literature was then picked up by the prairie writers like Rudy Weeb and Robert Croce and others, who defined the true Canada as the Western Canada, which of course was then picked up again by the BC writers who said, no, that's not the real Canada. We are the real Canada, with a strong influence from Native Canadian mythology in their writing, etc. To begin to round off this first section, Canadian literature began to diversify from the 1970s because of this debate tremendously. And in the 1980s and 90s, I think it really became mature. We will talk about, I hope, about the influence of the Canada Council and the tremendous sponsoring that's been going on. And some people have argued that Canadian literature is only there because the government put so much money in it. And I don't know whether that's true. I just read books, you know. I'm an academic. I don't form opinions. As a matter of fact, until 1985, the critic W.J. Keith predicted that when the plug was pulled out, Canadian literature were to collapse upon itself. Now, that I think is not true and is absolutely a myth in itself. If you look at writers like Atwood, but not just Atwood, there's so many people that we should mention on that chair, of course, and Timothy Findlay, but of course Jane Urquhart. If you look at these writers, you see that something's happened, something has really changed, and Canadian literature is here to stay. Now then, the evening is about one of these writers, and that is Jane, and I think most of you will have read the press releases, and there's not very much I need to, oops, that's my watch, say about her, but I want to say a few things about Jane before she holds forth herself. First of all, I think, or perhaps basically, the tremendous success, if you look at the scope of your work, 3 collections of poetry, a collection of short stories, and 4 novels, and essays and articles and other things as well. But the prizes that these books won from the beginning onwards, especially when the prose came out, is really tremendous, I think. Her first novel, The Whirlpool, 1992, won France's most prestigious prize, the Prix du Meilleur, Livre, Étranger, the Best Foreign Book Award. Her novel Away, for instance, to put things in perspective, was a national bestseller for, if this information is correct, 132 weeks, the longest of any Canadian book. And it won the Trillium Award in 1994, as well as another award. Her latest book, The Underpainter, which has been translated into Dutch, and is it out there? Yeah, okay. As, by the way, her other novel, Away, has also been translated. But The Underpainter won 1997's Governor General's Award. And this is no small achievement, I think, and confirms the quality of this work. I have analyzed her work, but I think what I would like to do, given the time, is to bring that up in the discussion. I would like to discuss a number of themes, such as the emphasis on 19th century settings, but also the interest of mysticism and the supernatural, which I think is crucial in your work, and landscape and the weather, not to mention publishing policy in Canada. But you are going to talk about that now, I think. And why not do it like this? You say what you have to say, and then we'll talk some more about it later on. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be here. It was just a great thrill to get the invitation from the Society, and wonderful to be here in Amsterdam, which is the most beautiful city I have ever visited, and a city which my daughter claims she will never leave. So I do hope that there's someone here who is willing to adopt her, because she's not leaving, and that's the way it is. She has a knapsack and a very little bit of money, not much, but it should keep her for a couple of days, and after that she's, it's up to you, basically. I think I'll get myself a glass of water first. I should say, first of all, I am not an academic. I am a writer of fiction. And therefore, whenever I speak publicly, there are only two subjects about which I can claim to be an expert: myself and the products of my imagination. It may seem just a bit self-involved to examine Canadian literature today from this isolated and narrow viewpoint. But in order to understand the startling impact of Canadian literature today, I think it's important that we examine the startling lack of impact of Canadian literature in the past. And this is something that I think it's important to remember not only took place all over the world, this startling lack of impact, but took place, I think, more importantly, in Canada itself. Canadians were not, I fear, very interested in Canadian literature, and maybe for many of the reasons that Will has stated. However, what I'm going to do to begin with, before I look at what's happening now, is I'm going to take you on a slight tour of my childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood. Recently, my mother asked me a very significant question. She wanted to know how on earth I became an author. She wanted to know when the moment was that I could say out loud for sure that I was an author. In fact, what she said to me was, "Where on earth did you get the nerve to say out loud that you are a Canadian author?" I thought long and hard about these questions, and it took a long time before I was able to answer them, even to myself. Eventually, I realized that my mother had raised three separate issues. How did I become an author? When did I know for certain that I was an author? And finally, when did I have the nerve to say, I am a Canadian author? It was this last question that fascinated me. Where did I get my nerve, I began to wonder, or more specifically, how did I get my nerve? I decided to explore the issue. And so I come to you today to talk about how I got my nerve, the nerve to say, I am a Canadian author. First, an aside about the woman who asked me this question, and my daughter can vouch for this. She is a very strong woman. She is 88 years old now. At the age of 10, after reading Jean Stratton Porter's Girl of the Limberlost, not a Canadian book, she approached the village bank near her farm to ask if she could borrow the typewriter, the only one in the district. She wanted to keep it for the weekend because she was going to write a novel. Astonishingly, the bank manager agreed, and the child my mother was then pulled the heavy machine back to her farm on her brother's wagon. She had already read all of Ellen Montgomery, all of Louisa May Alcott, a good deal of Charles G.D. Roberts and Charles Dickens. She had read Sir Walter Scott, Kipling, and an assortment of books about girls in British boarding schools. And I should say that would be the polar opposite of her life experience, for sure. But there was something about Girl of the Limberlost that sent her over the edge. Perhaps she wanted to improve on Girl of the Limberlost, give it a Canadian flavor. She refuses to say. The weekend novel was never published. The typewriter went back to the bank. The other thing you should know about my mother is that she recently announced that she wants the words, "She had her nerve," inscribed on her tombstone, if she dies. Nerve and having it is important to her. Hence her question concerning when I had the nerve to say out loud, I am a Canadian author. Why should it take nerve to say, I am a Canadian author? Let me explain. The Canada in which my mother grew up, and to a somewhat less extent, the Canada in which I grew up, was still very much a colony or a dominion. A colony being weaned from its mother country, yes, but one still young enough and insecure enough to look southwards for a foster parent. Real authors, I seem to remember from my childhood, lived and worked and published in either Britain or America. I'm sure there were some authors publishing here in Europe as well, published in English in Britain and America. And perhaps more importantly, they always had. Authors, as far as I could tell, lived either in Greenwich Village, where they wrote passionately while recovering from wonderfully wicked parties, or they lived in stately country houses with gray gardens, where they wrote in studies with leaden pane windows and large leather chairs, or in towers overlooking these extensive gray gardens. As a child, and even as a young woman, I loved these authors. I wanted them to have their wonderfully wicked parties and their leather chairs. But even though I myself was reading and writing a great deal, I simply could not believe that I would ever become one of them. I had access to neither debauchery nor mansions, and besides, whenever I conjured these godlike creatures in my mind, they were either wearing pants or the variety of eccentric female apparel, veils and scarves and diaphanous gowns on the one hand, or black beatnik attire on the other, that my mother would have objected to had I been able to get my hands on any of it. My mother had subscribed to the New Yorker since the early 30s. Now, I should tell you, this is actually quite a great story. I was born in a northern, what we call northern Ontario, not to be confused with the places where the Americans go to hunt. This was a mining community, and it was in the far north, which meant that when my parents moved in there, in the mid-30s, just after they were married, there were no roads. And the only way you could get in and out was by either bush plane or dog sled. Now, obviously, you're getting in and out by dog sled in the summer, although some would argue with that. Bush planes were important, and boats were important as well, canoes and various other boats. So I think my mother should let the New Yorker know that her extremely long subscription to the New Yorker was originally brought to her by a dog team, which I think is kind of wonderful. So anyway, she's subscribed to the New Yorker since the early 30s and was, as a result, an expert on the parties in Greenwich Village and the lunches at the round table of the Algonquin Hotel. Everyone attending these ongoing social events, she told me, was excessively suicidal. And then to prove her point, she would quote Dorothy Parker's poem, which is, "Razors pain you, rivers are damp, acids stain you, and drugs cause cramp. Guns aren't lawful, nooses give, gas smells awful, you might as well live." My mother was also reading P.G. Wodehouse and encouraged me to do likewise in order to appreciate the subtlety of British humor. One of this British author's many books, Leave It to Smith, I think it was called, had a plot that centered around the imminent arrival of a Canadian poet at an English stately home. The book was, and still is, screamingly funny to the British from the opening line, because what could be more unlikely than the existence of a Canadian poet? As the novel progresses, more and more and more young men arrive at the door claiming to be Canadian poets. If one Canadian poet is funny, a roomful is howlingly hilarious. In the final analysis, it turns out that, as we suspected all along, there is no such thing as a Canadian poet. Instead, a number of scurrilous antique dealers have decided to pose as Canadian poets in order to gain entrance to the stately home in question so that they can steal a rare sterling silver cow creamer or something of that nature. And so, for reasons which should be becoming obvious, in my childhood, I had serious doubts that as a Canadian, I would have the nerve to become an author. I decided then that after I stopped being a child star, an ambition I had been harboring for some time, I would gain access to the literary world by falling in love with one of the fascinating foreign male authors. I couldn't make up my mind as to whether I wanted him to brood distantly in a well-appointed tower and create works of genius, or whether he should behave wickedly at parties and then create works of genius. But in the end, I decided it didn't matter. The important thing was that he should be foreign, suicidal, tortured, miserable. The other important thing was that he should make me miserable as well. I had by this time heard all about the pre-Raphaelite women. It simply never occurred to me that I could be wild at parties, brood distantly in a tower, create works of genius, and make somebody else miserably unhappy. Time passed. My career as a child star was not panning out, despite the fact that I had committed to memory every word of every song in every musical written by Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Lowe, and etc. Moreover, after much practice, I had learned how to click my heels, something I had seen children do when my parents had taken me to the Music Man and the Sound of Music in New York. Shortly after we returned from that trip, I realized that since there was no such thing as a Canadian Broadway musical, that to be a child star on Broadway, it would be necessary for me to be within commuting distance of Times Square. I saved the $41.33 that I had learned was the cost of a one-way ticket to New York. Then I wrote to Richard Rodgers, care of the Sound of Music Theater, and asked him to pick me up at LaGuardia Airport in 1 month's time. I needed the month to get cute because at the time, alas, I was not particularly cute. I was hoping, however, that in a month's time, the braces on my teeth would be removed and I would have discovered some method of magically reducing my height. Anything, I reasoned, can happen in a month, and in fact, 2 things did. First, Richard Rodgers answered my letter, a miracle in itself, declaring that he would be delighted to pick me up at the airport when I turned 18. Secondly, I had started to grow breasts. Even I knew that no 18-year-old with breasts was going to make it big as a child star. But something else had begun to happen around that time. Like my mother, I had, of course, read all of Lucy Maud Montgomery's Anne books, Anne of Green Gables, Anne of Avonlea, Anne of the Island, Anne's House of Dreams, and Rilla of Ingleside. These I had devoured at approximately the same time as I was reading Dickens and Twain. The fact that they had been written by a Canadian and a woman had not particularly surprised me. These were girls' books, after all. Instinctively, I understood that they would never have been written by someone in a tower or a leather chair, and certainly not by someone recovering from the excesses of Greenwich Village. Furthermore, in these books, in spite of the fact that Anne proves herself to be as smart as Gilbert Blythe, the star of the class, and demonstrates over and over again that she has the vision and imagination to be a creative person, the important thing in the end seems to be that she outgrow her awkwardness, her violent temper, her physical plainness, so that she can be a suitable love object for the same Gilbert Blythe. Her singularity, her strong inner life, the quirkiness of her personality, the very things that should qualify her for vocation as an artist, are of course what attracts Gilbert to her. She fights romance with Gilbert for a bit, hates him, quarrels with him, competes with him, but eventually she has to admit to herself that she's in love with him. All of the girls who read these books wanted this to happen. We wanted her to smarten up, get beautiful, fall in love with Gilbert so she could marry him, get her house of dreams, give birth to Rilla, etc. I had devoured these Anne books, as I said, a couple of years before I began to grow breasts, and while I was still hoping to be a child star. I had even, believe it or not, imagined myself clicking my heels in a musical comedy about Anne. At the age of 13, my mother gave me another series of Montgomery books for Christmas, Emily of New Moon, Emily Climbs, and Emily's Quest. I was mildly insulted, believing that they were books meant for little girls, but I had always read everything I could get my hands on, and there they were, Emily, I soon discovered, was very different from Anne, for the simple reason that Emily had a singular ambition. More than an ambition, really. She had a calling. Like Bernadette of Lourdes, she had been singled out, set above the throng by visions and a remarkable sense of vocation. And she had her nerve. She didn't just want to be a writer, she knew she was a writer. Almost nothing could keep her from it. Punishment, rejection, isolation only served to increase her need to write. Suffice it to say that, while it is impossible to ignore the obvious autobiographical references in this trilogy, it's my feeling that in the Emily books, Lucy Maud Montgomery was not so much recreating her own past as she was attempting to create an idealized world where a young Canadian woman could develop her creative spirit. When the problem of being Canadian crops up, and it does crop up toward the end of the book, it is handled in a fascinating and attractive way. When a 17-year-old Emily has been offered the chance, I love this, I mean, this is so unlikely too, it's great. Mysteriously, you see, even though she lives in Prince Edward Island, somehow a very famous American editor happens to appear at her farm door or something, but however. When a 17-year-old Emily has been offered the chance by a successful editor to move to New York, her teacher, Mr. Carpenter, who, to his credit, has been encouraging and criticizing her work all along, fears that she will become as, quotes, yankified as the editor who is attempting to lure her away. This is a quote. "Janet Royal is yankified," he states. "Her outlook and atmosphere and style are all US. She isn't a Canadian any longer, and that's what I wanted you to be. Pure Canadian through and through, doing something as far as in you lay for the literature of your own country, keeping your Canadian tang and flavor. But of course, there's not many dollars in that yet." When Emily complains in her own defense that there's no chance to do anything here, her old teacher replies with a reference to the Brontes. "No," he says, "no more than there was in Haworth Parsonage." Reading the Emily books strengthened my nerve, but at the age of 15, I had a serious setback. You may remember that as a younger child, I had decided that I was going to marry a fascinating foreign author. By 15, however, I had decided that I was never going to get married because I had heard about and was practicing to become the muse. And somehow, Mrs. Muse had a funny ring to it. I had also discovered that regardless of what P.G. Wodehouse might think, there were Canadian authors, and especially there were Canadian poets. They were mostly men, of course, but that was okay because I was going to grow up to be a muse. The famous Canadian poets, it seemed, all lived in Montreal, a city which looked from the viewpoint of Toronto the Good, as it was then called, as if it might be capable of producing parties wicked enough to give Greenwich Village a run for its money. I had fallen in love with Leonard Cohen, the other famous Montreal poet, Irving Layton, being even then a little much for me to stomach, and perhaps we can talk about why later. Besides, he was too old, Irving Layton that is, but Leonard Cohen, I had never met him of course, Leonard Cohen was perfect. He was an older man, but still young. He was suffering, suicidal, I could tell from his poetry. I could also tell from his poetry that he was well-traveled, well-read, complicated, and capable of making me miserably unhappy. Now, this is a quote from Leonard Cohen, not myself. "I wanted my breasts, which had," well, not this part, a little later. "I wanted my breasts, which had grown enough to disqualify me from child stardom, but not enough to qualify me for much else, to, quotes, lie beneath his palms like the upturned bellies of small sparrows. I wanted him to love me and leave me and return to me soaked with rain. I wanted him to touch my," this is another quote from him, "my perfect body with his mind and let the river answer that he'd always been my lover. I was insanely jealous of Annie, Suzanne, and Marianne, who obviously did not understand him, I could tell from his poetry. I considered saving up some money and writing him a letter asking him to meet me at the airport, but I feared that he, like Richard Rogers, might object to my age. Besides, because of his absence from my life, he was making me miserably unhappy, and I was able, as a result, to produce a number of desperate poems about the fragility of my mental health. I began to spend a lot of time in the furnace room, a spot gloomy, dark, and strange enough for compositions of a depressing nature. I did not know, as I do now, that Leonard Cohen was a projection, that in fact I wanted to be Leonard Cohen. It's too bad I didn't know this, because if I had, I might have saved myself a great deal of grief. But I doubt it. Grief, after all, was what I seemed to want. It was undeniably a central theme in the very bad poetry I was writing, and I was a firm believer that one had to know one's subject matter. And so it transpired when I finally turned 18, instead of getting in touch with Richard Rogers and purchasing a one-way ticket to New York, I moved to Vancouver, which was another center of poetic activity, sought out and fell in love with a series of male Canadian poets. None of them loved me back. I was too young, too skinny. The revenge of the child star ambition had visited me in that I had never grown much in the way of breasts. Besides, I couldn't seem to stop writing. And worse, I couldn't seem to stop talking about writing. I talked to these poor male poets until their eyes crossed and they fell asleep with their foreheads resting on their beer bottles. I talked until they staggered away in their raincoats, looking for a more suitable partner whom they could take quietly to bed, or searching for their fellow male poets with whom they could carry on a more reasonable conversation about baseball or hockey. Not one of them wanted me to take them down to my place by the river. Not one of them wanted to spend the night forever. Who could blame them? I knew if they did not, they would never, no, they knew if I did not, that they would never get any sleep, and they would certainly not get any poetry written. I, on the other hand, suffering as I was all the time from rejection, was getting a great deal of poetry written, none of which I had shown to a single soul. Where were the women, you may well ask? Where were the women? There were women in the vicinity of the male poets, but none of them, as far as I could tell, were writing. Few of them were in the bars with the boys either, because most of them were at home in bed alone by 10:30. They, you see, had to go to work the next day in order to make enough money to support themselves and their male Canadian poets. Had I been studying contemporary Canadian literature, I would have undoubtedly discovered P.K. Page, Daphne Marlett, Sheila Watson, Phyllis Webb, Margaret Avison, Margaret Atwood, but I couldn't study contemporary Canadian literature for the simple reason that Canadian literature was unheard of in the British-based private school where I received my high school education, and the half-year course offered at the university focused entirely on the works of Leacock, Halliburton, Sinclair Ross, and the Confederation poets. So, as you can imagine, time went by, and things did not change very much at all. We continued to study the Confederation poets, if we studied anyone at all, and most of the time we didn't study anybody at all, for the simple reason that if we were studying literature, it was going to be either British and very occasionally American. I would say more than likely British in my period. However, things did change. And now it's a very interesting situation, to my mind anyway, that my daughter goes to university and does study Canadian literature. Things have definitely taken a turn for the better. I think that what has happened essentially is that not only have Canadians been given the opportunity to write, but they've also gone forth into the world and received honors from outside, which causes Canadians to take Canadian literature much more seriously. As I went through university, I encountered here and there the odd person who was attempting to write, the odd person who was attempting to start a a periodical, a journal, something like that. And occasionally, they were successful in their attempts. The Canada Council might fund it. You were required to produce a couple of issues of the journal yourself before the Canada Council would actually agree to help support it. Various presses were beginning to start. One of the most famous is Coach House Press, that had a board of directors that, well, in fact, Michael Ondaatje was one of the original members of the Coach House Press gang. That was back in the 60s and early 70s. There was another press started by Margaret Atwood's first husband, whose name was Jim Polk, and it was called House of Anansi Press. And in fact, I believe that you mentioned the survival theme that she writes about, and I think, in fact, that the book Survival was originally published by House of Anansi Press. So once that began to happen, people began to talk. Nationalism started to, begin to be discussed in Canada. In fact, there was a period, I think, in about the mid-70s when nationalism was a big issue and something that Canadians wanted to discuss at length. In my own case, what happened was that once I realized that I wasn't going to be a muse, I went back and got involved in my own daily life. I married and started raising children, and gradually I found that I could make my baby, who is now here tonight, Emily, nap for, say, 3 to 4 hours every afternoon, even though she was about 12 years old, didn't matter. She had to have a nap, and that gave me a period of time. So what I did with that time was I began, first of all, to write poetry, and then eventually I found that the lyric poem wasn't enough for me. And I started to write a series of lyric poems with a narrative background. And eventually I crept off to a mailbox and placed a novel, the manuscript of a novel, in the mailbox. And I was very fortunate in that it was picked up by McClelland and Stewart, which is the major Canadian publisher in Canada. Now, I should say that there are other publishers in Canada, but they're almost all American branch plants. Well, they are all American branch plants except for McClelland and Stewart. However, they do publish Canadian authors, and some of those authors have been translated here in Holland. But the only Canadian house that's left is McClelland and Stewart. So by the time some time had passed, I had published 4 novels, and my work had been translated into several European languages and published in both Mother England and in Stepfather America. I tell you this not to blow my own horn, but just to indicate how our world has changed since the days when P.G. Wodehouse confidently believed that the idea of a Canadian poet was patently absurd, and Canadian literature was not taught in my school. I'm just one of many Canadian authors whose books are being read and written about and taught, not just in Canada, but all over the world. Now, if you go to France, you might open the literary section of Le Monde and be greeted by a long article about Timothy Findlay or Alice Munro. Germany has recently taken up the work of several newer Canadian authors, Anne-Marie MacDonald and Anne Michaels, to mention just 2. And Michael Ondaatje, as we all know, is a household word everywhere. And perhaps, most astonishingly, this was a great moment, our own Carol Shields won the American Pulitzer Prize. I mentioned recently to a Canadian politician that if he really wanted to prove to his fellow members of Parliament how important Canadian literature is, he should simply hire a global clipping service to comb the world for press relating to Canadian literature on the one hand and Canadian politicians on the other for the period of 1 year, then bring out the measuring tape. There is no question which pile of clippings would be larger, and also no question about how much larger it would be. So what has changed? I think perhaps the biggest change that has taken place in Canada, both socially and as a result has affected the literature of our country, is that we have embraced something called multiculturalism. Now, again, at the risk of constantly comparing ourselves to the United States, I should say that multiculturalism is different from the melting pot idea that is behind immigration in the States. In Canada, immigrants are encouraged, in fact, to hang on to the culture from which they have left behind. Canada has always been a country of immigrants, though I'm afraid the little bit of Canadian history we were taught was rather narrow in that it tried to convince us that we were either British or French, and most of us really were neither. There's always been a huge Celtic side to Canada. There have been Ukrainians, Germans, Dutch, all kinds of European people have come to Canada, and in fact, Asian people have been in Canada for a very long period of time. Sikhs, Chinese on the West Coast, Japanese. So the first wave, though, of immigration took place in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, more so in the 19th century as a result of famine in Europe. There was another migration of European immigrants after the Second World War, and in fact, there was a bit of a migration between the wars as well. More recently, and in the past couple of decades, a large number of Asians and Caribbeans have made Canada their home. This has enriched and enlivened the culture in many ways and has made more diverse the kind of stories we connect to when attempting to determine who we are. And I think Will and I will talk about who we are, or who we think we are, or why we think we're anything or in the future. It has given us writers such as Michael Ondaatje, Rohinton Mistry, Dion Brand, Carrie Sakamoto, Neil Basundith, whose vantage point is Canadian, but whose view includes both their adopted country and the country of their birth. The other thing that has changed, certainly in the last half of the 20th century, is that the Canada Council was formed in order to provide both seed and operational money for development of the arts. Writers of my generation benefited from this in a number of ways. First, of course, was the possibility of being able to avail oneself of a long period of unstructured time. Now, I say possibility, I think it's important to know that, in fact, these grants are very competitive, and I believe at the moment the percentage is about 8% of the applicants who receive the grants, but at least the possibility is there. I should like to make mention of a dear friend of mine who is alas now deceased, a man called Joseph Drenters, who said something very, very important to me, and of course he was a Dutch Canadian. He once said that the difference between creative people and the rest of the world is that the rest of the world works to make money, whereas creative people try to get their hands on a little bit of money so they can work. And that is what the Canada Council has provided. So it's an important thing to know about who we are, or who we think we are, or why we think we're anything or in the future. It has given us writers such as Michael Ondaatje, Rohinton Mistry, Dion Brand, Carrie Sakamoto, Neil Basundith, whose vantage point is Canadian, but whose view includes both their adopted country and the country of their birth. The other thing that has changed, certainly in the last half of the 20th century, is that the Canada Council was formed in order to provide both seed and operational money for development of the arts. Writers of my generation benefited from this in a number of ways. First, of course, was the possibility of being able to avail oneself of a long period of unstructured time. Now, I say possibility, I think it's important to know that, in fact, these grants are very competitive, and I believe at the moment the percentage is about 8% of the applicants who receive the grants, but at least the possibility is there. I should like to make mention of a dear friend of mine who is alas now deceased, a man called Joseph Drenters, who said something very, very important to me, and of course he was a Dutch Canadian. He once said that the difference between creative people and the rest of the world is that the rest of the world works to make money, whereas creative people try to get their hands on a little bit of money so they can work. And that is what the Canada Council has provided. So it's an important thing to know about. So for the past several decades, not only has the Canada Council offered temporary subsistence to those artists who, and writers and musicians who have managed to receive the grants, but it has also helped to support small presses, literary magazines, and various other, I mean, it supports opera houses and all kinds of things. The Stratford Festival Theatre, which in turn encourages writers because Canadian plays are done there along with Shakespearean plays. Now, the other thing that has changed is that we now have an attentive and educated public. It's a very interesting thing in Canada that perhaps 10 years ago, it was unlikely that you would be able to find the majority of Canadian writers in Canadian bookstores. You would find perhaps Robertson Davies, Margaret Atwood, and after that it sort of fell apart, possibly Timothy Findlay if you were in the right bookstore. However, in the last decade or so, there have been a very committed group of independent booksellers who have not only been serious readers themselves, but have encouraged their clientele to read and appreciate Canadian literature, and who have founded book clubs and who have invited authors into their stores to read. And it's incredible to see how much that has changed things. The other thing, again, and this refers to the Canada Council, is that there has been in place a program to move Canadian authors. We have such a huge country that, you know, for instance, 50 years ago, a poet living in New Brunswick would never have had the chance to meet a poet living in Vancouver. Now there's a public reading program, and so not only do you meet the public in Vancouver, you often meet your fellow authors. And the world, of course, is paying attention to Canadian literature, and this has always made a huge difference to Canadians in general, simply because they know that if the world is paying attention, they ought to pay attention as well. We're hoping to sort of recover from that sometime in the future, but at the moment, it seems that it is still very important to have that kind of feedback from outside. So, now my own daughter, to her, Canadian literature is both a fact of life and a delight. She has studied it both in high school and at university, and she and her friends pay close attention to the new books that are being published every year. And it's a great pleasure to see this happening, not only to see people of my daughter's generation being so committed to their own literature, but also to see that people not much older than her, and in fact sometimes just a few years older than her, are writing, have the nerve, in a sense, to express themselves without ever even questioning it. So the time has passed, actually, for people to have to worry anymore about whether they have the nerve to say out loud they're a Canadian author. And I think this is a vast improvement. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, that was wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a little time to take a drink, stretch your legs, go outside, and then I suggest you come back as soon as you can. You can take your drinks with you inside the room and just get some fresh air and come back, and then we continue with the program. Thank you.
Is this on? Hello, yes? Oh, we have sound. Right, can we start? Okay. Thanks very much for coming back so quickly, all of you. Because I really want to fire away a few questions at you, Jane. And also weave into what we are saying a couple of questions that were passed on to me during the break. You yourself say a lot in other interviews about the importance of regionalism, of region in your writing. Now, I've already referred to this. People from the west, the prairie states, or even further, the mountains would...
Provinces.
Sorry?
Provinces.
Would... Thank you.
You're welcome.
This will go on forever. Would hardly refer to Ontario perhaps as being a region that has any... I know this is all, but I'm trying to provoke you. What does Ontario region mean to you? How did it shape you? And how does that inflect the writing that you are involved in?
Well, first of all, I should say that perhaps is this on? Is this okay? Yeah. Perhaps the most important regional writer from Ontario is Alice Munro, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with her short stories, but she's a brilliant, brilliant writer and publishes often in the New Yorker, actually. She writes about a part of southwestern Ontario in which she grew up, and which she still lives. She lives there for part of the year still. And what I find fascinating about that is how that little region of southwestern Ontario, which many of us are quite familiar with, and which seems to us to be ordinary in the extreme, has now gone out to the rest of the world. In fact, Alice tells a wonderful story about being at a dinner in Ireland where a very inebriated Irish writer was weeping on her shoulder, going, "Oh, the little towns of southwestern Ontario," and crying and sort of, and eventually fell down on the floor in grief and sorrow about the little towns of southwestern Ontario, which will tell you what kind of an impact a little tiny place can have if it's in the hands of the right author. So, from that point of view, I think it's important. I don't think that I necessarily represent regionalism, or certainly not as much as Alice does. However, I did grow up in Ontario. I grew up, first of all, in the far north of Ontario, and secondly, in the city of Toronto, and thirdly, on a part-time basis, every summer and every weekend, I spent in rural Ontario with my extended Irish-Canadian tribal family, who lived on farms here and there. And I think the important thing to remember about rural Ontario is that it was laid out in the 19th century. I mean, it was carved out of the wilderness in the 19th century. So the concession roads, the snake rail fences, the many of the farmhouses were built in the 19th century. So despite the fact that there are tractor trailers and cars and gigantic farm equipment now, it is nevertheless a world that was shaped by the 19th century. And I think so, from my point of view, that region has entered my work in terms of my interest in the 19th century. For instance, when I was growing up, my aunts and uncles still had wood stoves in their farm kitchens. And
I have a wood stove.
Oh, well, you see, there you are. You're living in who knows what century. Here, you can live in any number of centuries. We've only got the 19th century in Canada.
But can I interrupt you about the 19th century? Because you not only write about specific regions, and we've only talked about Ontario so far. We haven't even talked about Ireland or the Yorkshire Moors. But at least 3 of your 4 novels are set in the 19th century, or largely in the 19th century. What does that century do to you? Well,
I think partly I'm interested in the 19th century because of the reading material I had access to when I was a child, and all of which was British and most of which was written in the 19th century. So my inner life was developed in that way. Now, the second reason, of course, has to do with my family in rural Ontario, and as I mentioned, that was a 19th century world. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, who told me a number of stories. And of course, when one spends, I was a young child in my own family. I was sort of an afterthought, and my grandmother was, as a result, very elderly. And so I could, of course, touch the hand of the woman who had spent her childhood in the 19th century. Right. So there were these kind of generational connections that went on, and I knew many of her friends as well. So I think my imagination was sort of shaped by these people in the country. The other thing, of course, was that because I lived most of the time after we moved from the north in the city, the visits to the country represented an, quotes, other world to me. I mean, my imagination was more activated. It wasn't a daily life that I lived down there. It wasn't the life of going to school and, meeting one's friends. It was an other kind of life. And that, of course, always stimulates creativity and the imagination, I think.
Going on about that otherness in your writing, you seem to be extremely impatient with realism, I sometimes feel. You want to branch out into mythic scenes, into lyricism, into folklore. You've already mentioned storytelling and the relationship to landscape and to memory, to cultural memory. Is there no danger involved in the sense that if you sort of open up these worlds of the imagination that you leave your readers behind?
Well,
I noticed certain critics are a little bit
yes, well, I think
impatient
there's a feeling now in Canada that those of us who do write from the imagination, and particularly those of us who are interested in using language in
Right.
in poetic ways within
yes.
prose, there is a certain school in Canada that is, as they well should probably,
Right.
rebelling against this, because I think that what happens with, quotes, schools of literature is that one of their primary functions is to cause a reaction on the part of another younger group of writers who are being developed at the same time. I mean, it would be very sad if they all wanted to, for instance, be some kind of, ghost of Michael Ondaatje or something. So it's good that there is this, I think, bouncing off in a way. Well, you need a parent to rebel against. I think that's very true. Having said that, I should also say that while it may seem that I'm impatient with realism, I'm actually quite interested in realism. I'm fascinated by it. And my reading often leads me in that direction. I'm a great fan of realist writers, and I mentioned Alice Munro, for instance. She would be, I think, although you could argue against that too, she would be considered to be a realist writer.
Yes,
and
yes.
She's certainly someone whom I admire enormously. It's really, with me, it's a purely personal thing, and it has to do with the fact that when I'm writing, I want to go somewhere else. It's that simple. I don't want to continue to live my life in the books that I'm writing. So I suppose I could be referred to as an escape writer.
An escapist artist,
That's
yes.
right.
I think where it works especially well is in your novel Away, which I think is an absolutely marvelous book. Could you explain to the audience what that phrase, to be away, means?
This is a term that I heard about when I was in Ireland. My mother's side of the family is of Irish descent, the same family that is the tribal group that is out there in the country with their wood stoves. Burning turf. Well, not quite. Anyway, I went to Ireland because I had all my life heard stories about Ireland from this family, because the Irish never forget. And so I grew up not rebelling against the Americans. They were friendly turf. I grew up hearing about how dastardly the British were. Anyway, what happened was that I went to Ireland, and while I was in a pub in Ireland, and at that point doing a little bit of research into folklore, someone said to me, well, did you know that you can be stolen by the other world? And an exact replica of you can be left in your place. And when that happens to someone, they are said to be, quotes, away. And I realized that metaphorically as well as narratively that this was what I wanted to write about, because part of the reason I was in Ireland looking at my own family had to do, in fact, with the recent wave of immigrants that had arrived in Canada, many of whom had become my friends, part of my literary life, and who were involved in that sort of separation of self that happens when you are raised in one culture and then transplanted to another culture. And so talking to them and getting to know them better made me much more curious about what had happened to my own family when they had immigrated to Canada. And it was about that time that I began to realize just how much, with the exception of our native people, we are a nation of immigrants. It's just a matter of time. We all arrived sometime.
Right, yeah. Of course, Away tells the story of this Irish family that's starting in Northern Ireland itself, and then because of the potato famine and the disasters in the 1840s, I think, being more or less forcefully moved out of Ireland.
That's right.
At least that's the historical context. In this case, there were two very queer and quaint but sort of Dickensian landlords that shipped the families out. And then to arrive, I think one of the strongest scenes is these people come from Northern Ireland and find themselves, or the north of Ireland, I should say, and find themselves in a forest.
Yes. something they've never seen.
Something they've never seen.
Because Ireland was was totally cleared, deforested in the, I think the 16th century actually, 17th maybe.
Thereabouts, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You're the person that does all the historical research, but
yes, I'm the person who forgets it too.
But I really find it quite amazing how you bring that immigrant experience, which is, of course, an experience of the past. I mean, we can't relive the exact experience, but how you, by telling the tales of that experience, try to bring it back.
Well, of course, you know, again, one has to use one's imagination for these things, because you can only you can research facts, but you can't research emotions. You can't research character. You can't, you know, these things have to come from the imagination. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why I am interested in writing about the past, whether it be a couple of decades ago or, you know, 19th century. It's because I'm forced to use my imagination in those circumstances. But as far as Away was concerned, I think the best compliment that I had in terms of that book was the fact that several new Canadians came to me and said, thank you for writing that book, because we had nowhere to go to even begin to understand what it was like before we got here. And that's one of the sad things about the past in Canada, is that not only were we not taught Canadian literature, we were not taught Canadian history. And as a result, we believed for many, many years that history was something that happened in Britain. It didn't happen in Canada. But for me, it's been quite wonderful because I've been able to do such extensive research, and also because, as I was mentioning this afternoon, the files that I pull out of the archives have been untouched by human hands. So I'm really in virgin territory.
Right. Where you are perhaps not in virgin territory as far as Canadian writers are concerned is writing about World War I. There seem to be so many extremely good books. I mean, Timothy Findley's The Wars is perhaps one of the best.
Yes, I think it's probably the seminal work of fiction in that regard.
How do you explain this this fascination, or is it obsession, amongst Canadian writers with World War I?
I think there are a number of reasons for this. I can only, of course, really speak with any kind of authority about my own obsession with it, and that has to do with the fact that it was very catastrophic for Canada. I think that there were 66,000 Canadians killed in the First World War, and of those 66,000, 1/3 their bodies were never recovered. I mean, the First World War was a really particularly awful war in terms of mud and rats and just really terrible. And so there's that aspect, I think. We've all heard about it. Whether we were taught, we weren't in fact taught about Canada's role in the First World War, because the Canadians were considered to be part of the British Army, so that meant that we heard about the maneuvers of the British Army without being specific about Canada's role. But as far as the folkloric aspect of the First World War, it was very strong when I was growing up, because people, of course, remembered. And I think one of the most tragic parts of the First World War is something that I will never write about because it didn't really touch me or my family or my region, but was the horrible Battle of Beaumont Hamel, in which the entire, really, almost everybody who had enlisted or who had been drafted from Newfoundland was killed. So a generation of Newfoundlanders were wiped out by one battle, 15 minutes, a stupid kind of decision on the part of a general, and so, you know, they will never forget.
Part of it, as far as I understand it, is that the way that people were drafted was they tended to draft people, men from one village or one from one area, and then put them in one battalion or whatever it's called.
That's right.
So that if they were wiped out, then that whole
and also the
generation
Canadians
was wiped out.
themselves would try to be part of the same battalion. They wanted to be with their friends. These were farm boys who had never left home before, never mind crossed the sea. And
so you want to tell stories about the 19th century, about the immigrant experience. You want to tell stories about the World War I experience. There is something, or how would you? Is there no danger that, although you do a lot of historical research and you've just been to visit the battlefields in northern France, so you do all your groundwork, but is there no danger of a sort of solipsistic, of slipping into telling stories for the sake of telling stories? I was reminded of that when you talked about that Irish person who broke down in tears when he heard about somebody writing about, what was it, Ontario or some village in Ontario. The Irish in particular are said to be great storytellers, but also...
very sentimental.
Exactly. And they are sentimental for the sake of being sentimental,
Yes.
To some extent.
Well, I think that what I hope happens with my work is that while, of course, sometimes, I mean, not always, occasionally I've written about the present, actually, but sometimes
we'll
it's said
get
in
to
the
that.
past. Obviously, I can only really write about emotions or situations that I myself have experienced in the present. So I think it's a combination of various things, a little bit of research, a little bit of imagination, and then, of course, the experience. But I feel that, for me anyway, the experience has to be transformed before it can be interesting as a work of art.
Right.
And so, you know, this kind of shaping goes on. And without the shaping, I think it's just a report.
It's just a report.
Yes.
The reason I ask you is because we've talked about, if you look up your website, or it's your publisher's website, I think, about you.
I think it must be my publisher's.
Yeah.
I don't have one.
Well, it
hope.
says the Jane Urquhart website, so
Oh, really?
People might get all sorts of ideas.
I'm sure.
You better look it up. It says under ethnicity Irish.
That's interesting.
Yes, it does. It is, and I was wondering about that because there is, in the ethnicity debate in Canada, it can be very fierce.
Yes.
And there is all kinds of people claiming that they speak for either Canada or for a particular group. But this is a very tricky business because if you look at, perhaps Fasanji's novel No New Land, where these two groups of Pakistanis meet, and the one group is saying, we are demonstrating for Pakistan and Pakistani rights, and the other group happens to come from a Pakistani group of immigrants from East Africa, and they say,
Yes.
well, but that's not us, that
Yes.
you may be speaking for yourselves, but not for us. So this raises the whole issue of what is ethnic identity, and to what extent are you, as a novelist, writing about, in your case, Irish ethnic identity, at least as much creating it as reporting on it.
Well, I think there is always that danger, and certainly I would never claim to speak for either Ireland or Irish Canadians for the simple reason that, in fact, I hope that themes of that nature actually are raised in the novel a way. I know that as a result of people identifying too closely with either a nationality or ethnicity of one form or another, in Canada in the 19th century, our only political assassination took place, which figures in this book, and that was the assassination of a man, an Irish Catholic politician whose name was D'Arcy McGee. And interestingly enough, it was blamed on Irish Catholics, and then the Irish Catholics turned around and blamed it on the Protestants. In fact, the whole sort of terrible political nightmare, the whole circular nightmare of Northern Ireland was going on in Canada in the last half of the 19th century. There was a very fierce kind of ethnic thing going on between the Orange Lodge and the Irish Catholics. So I think that the trouble with that, with those kinds of political situations, is that on some level, and this brings us back to Irish sentiment, on some level they're very romantic, and I think in Ireland is a place where you discover that in a huge way. All of those tear-jerking, sad songs about beautiful young men dying under the moonlight as a result of being shot in the heart by the enemy are being sung every night in the pubs. And of course, this is not a good way to achieve peace, I don't think.
As a matter of fact, some critic said about Changing Heaven that they found it difficult, and I quote, to know if Changing Heaven was a romance or a novel that explored how the conventions of romance can distort women's lives. Again, I don't want to go on about this point, but when you go down the road, the path of romance, there is always this danger, isn't there? That
Oh,
the
I
critic
think so,
points
yes.
to.
And in fact...
Does it bother you, this kind of comment? Or
No.
do you simply say, okay, that's the wrong reader for my book, clearly?
Well, not really, because in fact, I think that in terms of Changing Heaven, what was said there was was very true, that it was difficult. It was difficult for me as a writer to know whether I was writing about romance and passion, or whether I was writing a book about how romance and passion have affected women's lives, have narrowed women's lives, and have made them, in some ways, very unidimensional. I believe, however, in the final analysis, and this is something that's extremely important to me as a writer, by the time I finish a book, it usually has taught me something. And if it hasn't taught me something, I'm pretty sure I'm not finished, which is why I'm not sure I'm finished the book I'm working on right now, but however, that's another story. And what Changing Heaven taught me was that no, this was not the route that was going to make a woman's life more meaningful or richer. And in the same way, Away taught me about the dangers of excessive identification with any group, or exaggerated identification.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah. But to bring it back to women and romance and passion, there's quite a bit of that in your work. And I read one feminist analysis. I know Jaap doesn't like feminist analyses. Where is he? Has he gone already? But I want to raise this, who said that, I think it was, do you want me to look it up, or are you not?
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Anyway, the point was basically that what was so feminist about your work was that you showed how your female heroines were all being enclosed and captured and locked up in all kinds of confined spaces by these men that they happen to be in love with. That's not the way how I read your book.
No, that's not the way I hope I write it either. I would say if there's any locking up going on the part of my female characters, and in terms of their obsessions or passions or whatever, it has to do with themselves.
Right.
They are locking themselves into these, well, they're caught, really. They're caught in cages of their own making in very many ways. Now, they may have projected all of this, as I did, to old Leonard Cohen. They may have projected this, this problem onto the man in the story, but in fact, I don't believe that, you know, one gender imprisons another gender. I think it's possible for a human being to be abusive towards another human being, but it's kind of a contract, I think, in some ways. And so that's something else that I wanted to explore when I was working, for instance, on the Underpainter. Which is a story about an artist and, well, partly about an artist and his model and various other things as well, but really has to do with art and exploitation. I think you have to be careful as a writer and as an artist that you don't fall into the trap of being too exploitative with your material.
So you wouldn't, before we go into that, you wouldn't call yourself a feminist writer. I don't know what that means, by the way.
Well,
but
first of all,
you read about this.
Yes, there's another one of those terms that's impossible to define, but I'm not a political writer. So for instance, if I were interested in writing about feminism or anything of a political nature, I would likely write an essay rather than a novel. I'm interested in human character and human interaction.
And how to make sense of what they're doing. To go back to your previous remark about artists exploiting not just the material, but the people they work with, quite literally in this book, The Underpainter, the main character, Austin, exploiting the model, Sarah. To what extent is that, I was wondering, and I hate this question myself because I never want to relate the book I read to the person that wrote it, but I was too much tempted to ask you to what extent this was a metaphor for what you do yourself. Well, it's a book about hiding and showing, but isn't that what you're doing yourself?
Yes.
Given that you said that most of your work is autobiographical in a certain sense.
In a certain sense, absolutely. Yes, that was what that book taught me. I realized when I had finished writing it that I was going to have to answer the question, where did the character of Austin Fraser come from? Because he is a painter and I am married to a painter. And
I didn't ask that question.
I know you didn't. You were very good. But everyone else did.
I've read all your interviews. So.
And it became something that I needed to ask myself. Where did this character come from? Because in fact, he's very, very different than my husband. And anyway, that isn't the way I work. But I think it was a potential side of myself. And I think it's a potential side of any creative person to stop living long enough to observe and then take the observations in question home with them and then start to work with them to shape them, to transform them in some way or another, which is essentially what we do. So it's not a bad thing to do that. It's a bad thing when that becomes the most important thing in your life, when art, I believe, anyway, for me, that art that conquers life will eventually conquer the art as well. So it's a delicate balance.
It must be, yeah. And perhaps one of the things that, I haven't read this anywhere, but one of the things I would say about your work is that you dare take that risk, dare take to do that balancing act of using historical research, using autobiographical data, and yet try to create something more out of that, something, a tale or some form of creative writing that adds meaning to what we already know and what everybody can look up, either in your biography or in a library or in an archive. But that tension surely must be very delicate, because you can slip from facts
and
into...
you can slip from facts into historical novels, for instance, which is not what I write.
Which
I
is
hope.
not what you write.
You can also slip into facts so much that you lose the emotional tension. You lose feeling, in a sense. I think, for instance, in the Underpainter, it was very important for me to, in the beginning, I realized that this novel was not going to work unless I wrote it in the first person, because I kept on slipping out of the character, who was a male character, and I found myself pulling back from him too much and observing him, and in fact judging him more than I felt was necessary under the circumstances. And also, he kept slipping away from me as a result, because I lost the emotional connection. And the minute I started to write it in the first person, I came back. And he came back, and then the character started to develop. So it's a very tricky business. You just and of course I never know when I sit down to write a novel whether or not that novel is going to work, or whether or not the point of view that I have developed is going to be something that will be meaningful. Halfway through the book, you might discover, oops, this isn't working.
That's very interesting. I noticed, of course, that for the first time you used in your novels, the first-person narrator, but I can see how important it was, because otherwise the character slips away into his own problems, which is basically that he cannot emotionally attach.
That's right.
To other people.
And not being able to emotionally attach is entirely different than not having emotions.
Exactly, yes,
so
absolutely. Yeah.
It was quite an experience, though, I have to say, because I never would have thought I would have been able to write from the point of view of a man. Never crossed my mind, but
let alone such a person.
Yeah.
You said just now, and I think you've also said it in certain interviews that I've seen, that when you set out to write a book, you say, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where the story is going to lead me. Again, given that you try to cross the borders of the boundaries of realism into myth and into folklore, doesn't that bring you again in a dangerous area if you set out not quite knowing where a story is going to take you, not quite knowing where the novel is going to work?
I don't, in fact, believe that. I think it's actually better if I don't know. I find that when I have run into problems, it's when I have been over-plotting. There's a kind of, you have to have faith, or I have to have faith when I'm writing a novel, that the novel will take me where it wants to go. And it's very difficult to describe this, for instance, to students who I've taught some creative writing courses. And it's very difficult to convince them that this will happen if you let it happen. Because they, of course, have gone through a whole school system which tells them how to do things.
Exactly.
And now you're trying to tell them, no, you really don't want to know how to do this. It's one of the hardest things for a student to grasp. And, in fact, for most writers to grasp. But I believe that many writers have this in common, this business of writing a book the way you read a book.
But so you don't sit down at home in your Ontario Gothic house, contemplating the past with crates of archives around you, and you don't actually take a sheet of white paper and say, okay, I'm going to write about 3 characters, and they're called so-and-so, and then chapter 1, chapter 2.
Now, I may do that a little further down the line, second draft, third draft, or whatever, I might make notes. But in the beginning, I just start to write.
Because it seems in a sense, such a romantic notion of what, such a 19th century notion of a writer. You wait for inspiration, and then you bang this thing on the paper.
It's better if you don't wait for inspiration.
Right, so you don't wait for inspiration, but you don't make outlines either.
No.
Right.
I think that, the few times that I have made outlines, they've been discarded day 4.
Yeah.
The good news is that no one is watching you when you write. This is part of the reason why I love being a writer. There's no one there watching you make a fool out of yourself or make mistakes or whatever. So you can give yourself quite a lot of freedom, quite a lot of space. That's another thing that I do tell students. Don't forget that there's nobody here watching you do this. You can write something and tear it up and throw it away. You don't have to produce a masterpiece right away. It's such a long, long process.
Right. And I guess we should also judge an author basically on his or her oeuvre rather than specific texts. Do you find that pressure from the press these days? I mean, publishing is not just, as we've just established, a question of a 19th century notion of waiting for inspiration, and then in your lonely attic with your candle, and then you send it in an envelope, and then all of a sudden you find you wake up, finding yourself famous.
Next day on your dressing room, they've hung a star. That stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It is in a sense a serious business too. I mean, you tour the world.
Well, it has become, I think, in recent years, a much more serious business. Now, again, I'm looking from the point of view of Canadians.
Right.
It's the combination of chain bookstores and publishing houses and large advances for authors. Put all that into the pot and stir it around, and you have a pretty desperate business. One of the good things, I suppose, about Canadian literature being ignored was the fact that there was no pressure to make money. I don't think any of us ever in a million years imagined we would ever make any money, and that includes Atwood, Ondaatje, all the people around Coach House Press, around these small presses. I mean, we were basically beautiful people doing our thing, and we expected that we would have to support ourselves as best we could by some other means.
But you're making the money now.
Yeah. Which is good.
Which is good, and we
and
all
helps support our wonderful country with lots of taxes.
I'm sure that the Canada Council is very pleased to hear this.
Yes.
Sounds like a good investment. But I was wondering, because I've also seen some very vicious reviews, especially of your early work.
Oh yeah, I had some wonderfully vicious reviews.
Well, I won't quote from them, but there was this one American review about your first novel, Whirlpool. Who basically said it was dull and boring and vague. And
then went on to attack all of Canadian literature.
Exactly, and then he said it was just a conspiracy because he'd heard all these reviews from Canada was thrilling and stimulating and exciting, and he just concluded that this was some closed shop.
That's right, and that
where
there was
the
something going on.
writers
We're
hang out
trying
in
to
the
take
same
over
bars as the
American
critics
literature. Yes, that's
yes.
right. Yeah. Now, he wrote a book called The Little Toaster That Ran Away.
Yes.
Which, unfortunately,
flopped.
No, it did not. It was wildly successful,
Was
and
it?
Walt Disney made a movie out of it.
Oh.
So, you see, there is no justice.
There is. We can provide details after the conversation.
Thomas Dish.
Yes.
One never forgets those first bad reviews. And this one actually almost caused an international incident because this wasn't in just any old publication. Hell no. This was in the New York Times Book Review. Yeah. So I got to go on the radio in Canada and talk about it while everyone was incensed. And
It is my impression, though, but you can correct me, that more than in Europe, not so much in the United States perhaps, there is a closer connection between, I find, the writers, the critics, the university teachers. I can mention several well-known Canadian novelists, writers who are university teachers. There is the criticism, the production of the text, the evaluation, the assessing seems to be slightly closer than you would find anywhere in Europe. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think that, you know, as I said, one of the good things about the Canada Council reading series and that kind of thing was that we all were able to get to know each other.
Yes, yes.
However, we all know each other.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so it can look a little incestuous from the outside. And often is. I mean, there are certain book review editors in Canada who I think are sensitive enough to that issue that they will, for instance, send someone with a very high profile in Canada who publishes a book, they'll send the book outside the country for review in order to get some kind of a fair review. But that has been happening less and less, I think.
You think so? You think it was a phase?
Yeah. So now, you know, having said that, there is a whole new group of Canadian authors who are emerging now, and while they all know each other, we don't necessarily know them.
Right.
And so I think things are becoming perhaps a little healthier in that regard.
I certainly, before we round off, I certainly find the debate about the future of multiculturalism amongst various new writers very fascinating, because there is no longer that notion that this is a holy cow sort of topic that you cannot talk about in polite conversation.
There was, for instance, 10 years ago, a large discussion about whether or not Canadians of European descent should be able to write about Native people.
Right, yes.
Or whether that should be left entirely to the Native people. And that was a debate that raged out of control. In fact, it wasn't even a debate. For a while, it was, you know, very much a sacred cow. But that seems now to have passed. I think that one of the things that is very interesting about Canada is that it just is practically incapable of defining itself. And that's true of its literature as well. So we just keep changing.
Right, so the question, what is Canadian or what is Canadian literature, is actually a very liberating one. We've established we can't answer it, and that's good.
That's right, yes.
Before we open the floor for questions from the audience, what would you care to share with us where your current work is taking you? What are your current projects? What will we expect? Something about World War I in northern France?
It in fact takes place. The novel takes place between the wars, and has to do with the building of a very large Canadian war memorial near Arras in French. It's called the Vimy Memorial, and it's actually a wonderful piece of sculpture. Huge. I think it's the largest war memorial in Europe. So that's partly what partly what it focuses on. There's a lot of regionalism in it as well. So it's sort of regionally set in France and in southwestern Ontario, where I live.
Okay, we're back home.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Are there any questions? Is the next step? Yes, please.
Well, it's interesting you should ask that question, because I've just finished reading for the second time his book about the Battle of Vimy Ridge, called Vimy. I think that he has made a hugely valuable contribution to Canadian culture, actually, and especially within Canada, by doing what our schools didn't, and that is providing us with a quite readable look into various aspects of our history. He's extremely popular in Canada. I don't think he is read all that widely abroad, although here you are asking me the question, so what can I say? And here I am in Amsterdam. He was one of the authors whose books you would see in bookstores before you saw Canadian literature being carried widely in bookstores. So he's made a big impact. And he, of course, writes nonfiction. He has never written a novel, and I don't think he ever will. He's interested in the social fabric of Canada and in various aspects of our past. Did I answer your question?
Can't see. Yes?
I want to ask you a sort of Irish question. You talked about the 19th century novelists that you read growing up, the British and American writers, and how they interested you. And I wondered about perhaps whether you are interested or interested in earlier 19th century Anglo-Irish women writers. I was thinking of people like Teach, like Sydney Olsen and Maria Edgeworth, both of whom constructed really important versions of Ireland and a type of nationalist identity around the 19th century.
Amsterdam, and he was one of the authors whose books you would see in bookstores before you saw Canadian literature being carried widely in bookstores. So he's made a big impact, and he of course writes nonfiction. He has never written a novel, and I don't think he ever will. He's interested in the social fabric of Canada and in various aspects of our past. Did that answer your question?
Can't see. Yes?
I want to ask you a sort of Irish question. You talked about the 19th century novelists that you read growing up, the British and American writers, and how they interested you. And I wondered about perhaps whether you are interested or interested in earlier 19th century Anglo-Irish women writers. I was thinking of people like Teach, like Sydney Olsen and Maria Edgeworth, both of whom constructed really important versions of Ireland and a type of nationalist identity around the 19th century.
I have to admit that while I've definitely heard of Maria Edgeworth, I don't know the other author at all. And no, I didn't read those books.
Well, you'll know that Sydney Olsen wrote this brilliant book called The Wild Irish Girl.
Okay, no, don't know it. I'm sorry. We probably wouldn't have had access to
But
those
neither
particular
was I
things. Uh-huh.
which is something that's sort of become really popular now that she wrote in the early 19th.
Right, so she's being revived in a sense. I will read her though. Thanks.
Any further questions?
Somebody at the back.
Yes, please.
I was very interested in when you were speaking of going to Ireland and using your experiences there for writing away. And I remember when Mordecai Richler was here, he said he felt the urge to go away from Canada. He lived for 20 years and went to England, and then came back, and then he knew who he was, he had his identity. I did that myself. I left 25 years ago from Canada and I came here. And since that time, I've become more and more interested in being a Canadian because you're always confronted with, first everybody thinks you're American.
Mhm.
And then I say, no, I'm North American and Canadian. Well, then that's fine. But I wonder if you ever had that feeling that you really had to get away to find your identity as a Canadian author.
Yes, I think that's very true. When I was 29, I guess, my husband was on sabbatical and we went to France for a year and lived in a little medieval French village while he was doing research. And that was the year that I really began to write seriously. And I began writing about Canada. It seemed as if I had to, in order to understand who I was and what I was going to do, I had to be that far away from my own country. I think it's a very valuable thing to do, and I can't really describe why. It just seems to happen. It's almost as if, you transplant yourself like a seed and suddenly you begin to grow. So, yes, I've found that to be a really valuable experience. I was just wondering when Mordecai Richler was talking about leaving because of all the Quebec issues, etc. But this would have been when he went to London 20 years ago, right? Yeah. Yes.
Yes, that's it.
How do you feel about others writing about Canadian themes? If you hadn't known it from the jacket copy, would you have known that Annie Poole in the shipping news was not a Canadian, and the Canadian writers present are exploiting Canadian material in this way?
That's a very good question. And first of all, it throws up a number of issues. And perhaps the most important issue is whether or not Newfoundlanders consider themselves to be Canadians. And that is we hear all about Quebec and we hear about the West, wanting to separate in their direction. Quebec wants to separate. Newfoundland became part of Canada in 1949. And before that, they were a British colony. But they were a British colony that Britain mostly ignored. So they became fiercely independent out there on their island, and they still are extremely independent. And in fact, they have their own national anthem, which is filled with awful weather, just the most appalling weather. It's things like when winter sends its freezing rain across the barren strand and all the people go insane, we love thee, Newfoundland, that kind of thing. So I was fortunate enough to be writer-in-residence at Memorial University for a term, and I adored it there, but I found out very early on that there were certain things I had to do in order to survive, and one of them was to never refer to Newfoundland as part of Canada, or part of anything else, for that matter. Now, to get on to Annie Proulx, that's another issue. I was just saying to someone today that despite the fact that Annie Proulx was an American, and despite the fact that the Newfoundlanders, and particularly the Newfoundland writers, were enraged when she published that book. They liked it for a little while, for about a week, and then it got really successful, and they got really mad, and then they all hated it. Despite all that, in fact, I think Annie Proulx has had a wonderfully positive effect on Newfoundland culture, because now the same writers who were as angry as they were about Annie Proulx's shipping news being as successful as it was and exploiting Newfoundland and all the rest of it, have in fact been picked up as a result of an increased interest in Newfoundland. And so they're being published now internationally. And I think it was, plus the fact that even when they were really angry, they had to admit, she got it right.
Anybody else?
Yes.
Yes, please.
I'd like to know, you said we all know each other, talking about Canadian authors and writers.
Mm-hmm.
How is that with the French Canadians?
Well, of course.
Do you know each other? How do you communicate?
Okay.
Do you receive
I should have qualified that. The English Canadian authors all know each other, and the French Canadian authors all know each other, and this is one of those statements. Some of the English Canadian writers know some of the French Canadian writers some of the time. And you know how that one ends. There's a language problem, of course, and there's a very big problem in Canada that is a corollary of this language problem, and that is that our English Canadian publisher, I can say publishers if we include our small presses, though they're not quite as guilty, do not translate and publish French Canadian authors. And at the same time, the English Canadian authors who have become whose work has been picked up internationally in recent years, are published in France and imported back into Canada, into Quebec. It's a big problem, and in fact, it's one that has become worse in recent times, and I think it's a great tragedy, because when I was growing up, for instance, we were reading Gabrielle Roy. By that I mean perhaps a little later, when I was 18 or 19, and we were exposed to Anne Hébert and people like that. But now,
Exposed sounds almost.
yes, it does, doesn't it? Yes, it's not what I meant.
It's a great novelist. Yeah.
Especially not in terms of Anne Hébert. But now, in fact, we have very little access to the newer writers in Quebec because they're not translated, and unfortunately, to our shame, many English Canadians are not bilingual. Some French Canadians are not bilingual, but many more French Canadians are bilingual than English Canadians.
Can you just specify that? Because I'm taking full for SARS word and the needs to say that it has been translated into English?
Yes, it has, and published more often than not by the smaller presses, however. Nicole Brossard, you're right, has definitely been. And another person, Roch Carrier, has been translated as well. But, you know, there are many, many authors that we never see. Many plays we never read or have performed as well. And, you know, the theater of Quebec is very vibrant. So it's a big problem. And it's one I think that, you know, should be looked at very carefully because obviously it contributes to the other larger social and political problems.
No more burning questions. It looks like you've answered all questions there are.
Okay.
Okay. Well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jane, Urquhart, and Wil Verhoeven for investing time in our program tonight. That was really very special. I do realize and did realize how little I knew about Canadian literary life, and you opened up a lot of information to all of us, I think. Thank you very much. I wish you another wonderful day in Amsterdam tomorrow.
Thank you.
And Emily a longer stay, of course. And thank you all for having been here tonight. Our next lecture will be with the American journalist Mark Denner. All the information is in the hall. He has been writing extensively on Haiti, El Salvador, and Bosnia. And it will be a totally different character than, the event will be totally different from tonight, but I hope to see you there. Thank you very much, and come again.